He waited more than 3 decades for the moment that finally ended everything. No visitors, no final meal, just a quiet room, a few witnesses, and a sentence that left everyone guessing. When it was over, some people called it justice. Others called it far too late. But the story behind how he got there is far more unsettling than the execution itself. Because this wasn't a crime committed by a stranger in the night. It wasn't random, and it wasn't reckless. The person responsible didn't break in, didn't rush, and didn't panic at first. He walked into that house knowing exactly where he was, and exactly how long he had. And what happened that afternoon would change one family forever, and spark a case people are still arguing about today. It was just after school when he walked up to the house, backpack still hanging off one shoulder. Everything looked normal at first. Same street, same quiet afternoon, but something felt off the moment he reached the driveway. His mother's car wasn't there. That had never happened before. The front door was locked, which was strange on its own. He went around through the carport, let himself in, and stepped inside. He dropped his books near the door, kicked off his shoes, and walked toward the kitchen, still expecting to hear his mother's voice or the sound of her moving around the house. Instead, the room was silent. She was lying on the floor. At first, his brain couldn't process what he was seeing. She wasn't moving. Her hands were restrained. There was blood on the floor, far more than an 8-year-old could understand. For a few frozen seconds, nothing made sense. Then the panic hit all at once. Just then, a car pulled up outside. A family friend had arrived to drop off his sister from school. He ran to her, struggling to explain what he'd seen. She followed him inside, and the moment she understood, she turned them around and rushed them back out, shielding them from a scene no child should ever have to witness. Police and paramedics were called immediately. But by the time they arrived, it was already clear there was nothing they could do. That quiet house, on a quiet street, had become something else entirely. And once investigators stepped inside, they realized this wasn't just a break-in gone wrong, it was something far more deliberate. The kitchen didn't look like the aftermath of a random burglary. It looked like a struggle, one that hadn't gone the way the attacker expected. There were blood stains across the floor, signs of a violent confrontation, and a knife resting in the sink on top of a washcloth, as if someone had tried to clean it before leaving. Nearby, detectives found plastic zip ties. The same kind used to restrain her hands. The medical examiner would later confirm what the scene already suggested. She had been beaten and stabbed multiple times. One injury to her neck was fatal, but not instantly. Long enough for bruising to form. Long enough for her to fight back. That detail alone told investigators this wasn't quick, and it wasn't accidental. As they moved through the house, another pattern started to emerge. Drawers were open. Jewelry boxes sat half empty. Specific items were gone. Pieces she wore often, things someone would only know about if they'd been inside the home before. Even her car was missing. But what stood out the most was what wasn't there. No broken windows, no damaged doors, no signs of forced entry anywhere. Whoever did this hadn't broken in. They had walked inside with confidence, either invited in, or knowing they wouldn't be questioned. And that realization changed everything. Because now the question wasn't what happened inside that house. It was who already knew their way around it. Once investigators accepted that the killer hadn't forced his way in, the focus shifted fast. They began looking at anyone who already knew the house, people who had been inside before, people who wouldn't raise suspicion just by showing up at the door. That's when one name started to stand out. About a year earlier, a young carpenter had worked inside the home for months. He wasn't a stranger passing through. He fixed cabinets, hung doors, and moved freely from room to room while the family went about their day. By the time the work was finished, he knew the layout of the house better than most visitors ever would. Months later, completely by chance, the family ran into him at a mall. The conversation seemed harmless. He asked how they were doing, how the house was holding up, and whether there might be more work soon. He mentioned needing money. Nothing about it felt alarming at the time. But there was one detail that mattered more than anything else. It didn't take long for the story to crack. Just hours after the attack, the same man investigators were quietly circling walked into a local pawn shop. He didn't hesitate. He placed a gold chain on the counter and handed over his information like there was nothing to hide. The necklace matched the description of one the victim was known to wear almost daily. And his name was written right there on the pawn slip. When police later examined the chain more closely, they noticed a dark stain clinging to the metal. Lab tests confirmed it was blood, matching the victim's blood type. Suddenly, suspicion turned into something far more serious. That was only the beginning. Investigators had documented bloody shoe prints at the scene, pressed into the kitchen floor during the struggle. When they analyzed the pattern, it pointed to a specific brand and tread. A search of the suspect's home led them to a pair of shoes that matched. Then there were the zip ties. Inside his car, detectives found plastic restraints identical to the ones used in the attack. The same size, the same style, not something you'd expect to find by coincidence. Piece by piece, the evidence began stacking in one direction. And no matter how he tried to explain it away, the timing was becoming impossible to ignore. When police finally confronted him, he insisted there was an explanation for everything. He said he hadn't been anywhere near the house when it happened. According to him, he'd been working on a boat that morning, then stopped by a relative's place to shower before heading out again. At first, that story almost held up. A family member confirmed he had shown up around late morning. But then came the details that didn't line up. He wasn't empty-handed. He was carrying gloves, a bag, and a pair of red designer sunglasses. Those sunglasses would become a problem. Around the same time, a woman came forward and told police he had given her a pair that looked exactly like the ones reported missing from the house. A small detail on its own, but stacked on top of everything else, it hit hard. And the physical evidence kept pushing back against his version of events. The shoes, the restraints, the jewelry already turning up for cash. Even the victim's car, later found abandoned not far away, told the same story he was trying to escape. What he described as coincidence, investigators saw as a timeline collapsing in real time. Because at this point, it no longer looked like a bad day or a moment of panic. It looked like someone who had walked in with a plan, and was now scrambling to outrun it. Up until that point, there was still room for doubt, at least on paper. The case was built largely on circumstantial evidence, and his defense was ready to lean into that. But then, just weeks before the trial was set to begin, he made a decision that shattered whatever benefit of the doubt remained. Late one night, he escaped from jail. For more than a day, he vanished. No note, no explanation, just gone. When police finally caught up with him, it wasn't far from where he'd started, but the damage was already done. The headlines exploded. Newspapers painted him as dangerous, reckless, a man willing to do anything to avoid consequences. The nickname followed soon after, and once it did, it stuck. By the time he was brought back into custody, his image had shifted in the public eye, and there was no undoing that. Prosecutors seized on the escape immediately. To them, it wasn't fear. It was guilt. Proof, they argued, that he knew exactly what he had done and couldn't face what was coming next. And as the trial finally got underway, one thing became clear. The jury wasn't just judging the evidence anymore. They were judging the man standing in front of them. The jury didn't take long. After just a few hours of deliberation, they returned with a guilty verdict. First-degree murder. The sentence that followed was final and unforgiving. Death. In the early 1990s, he was transferred to death row, where time stopped moving the way it does for everyone else. Days blurred into years. Years turned into decades. Life became measured in appeals, court filings, and waiting. From behind bars, he fought the sentence over and over again. His lawyers argued the trial had been unfair, that media coverage had poisoned the jury, that his background and mental state should have mattered more. But each time the courts reviewed the same trail of evidence, the jewelry, the blood, the pawn record, the matching prints, and each time, they reached the same conclusion. The door stayed shut. As the years passed, the world outside changed completely. New laws, new technology, new conversations about punishment and justice. But inside that cell, nothing changed at all. On the morning it was set to happen, he woke up before sunrise inside the prison. Like everyone in his position, he was given a few final choices. A special last meal, a visit from loved ones, a chance to speak with a spiritual advisor. He declined all of it. No family came, no friends, no one sat across from him to say goodbye. As the hours passed, he remained alone, waiting for a moment he'd known was coming for most of his life. Just before the evening, he was escorted into the execution chamber. Witnesses watched silently as he was secured in place. When asked if he had any final words, he spoke softly, directing them toward someone in the room. He said he was sorry he had missed them. He said he loved them every day. No explanation followed. No names were mentioned. The meaning was left hanging in the air. Moments later, the process began. His breathing slowed. There were a few small movements. Then nothing at all. Within minutes, it was over. After 35 years on death row, the case was officially closed. But the question it left behind still hasn't been After all those years, the punishment was finally carried out. The courts closed the file. The state moved on. On paper, the system did exactly what it promised to do. But cases like this don't end when the clock runs out. A family lost a mother in the most unthinkable way. A child grew up carrying a memory no one should have. And a man spent more than half his life waiting for a moment that would erase him from the world, but not from the debate. Some people believe justice was served the moment the sentence was carried out. Others believe no outcome could ever balance what was taken that afternoon. And after 35 years of waiting, the answer still isn't clear. So what do you think? Was this justice, or just the end of a story that never really had one?